welcome everyone, and welcome to what promises to be an amazing discussion on a wonderful book by my colleague and friend, Professor Sheryll Cashin. First, I'll say a bit about who I am. I am the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Urban Law and Policy. I teach at the law school, obviously, and also have a joint appointment with the McCourt School of Public Policy. I think it's safe to say that the things that Professor Cashin and I write about overlap somewhat. So it's particularly, I am honored that she asked me to do this, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'm sure that Professor Cashin is not an unknown figure to anyone on the call, but in case that's not the case, let me say just a couple words about her. She is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown University. She is an author who has written not just influential legal scholarship, but many books, and hopefully she'll touch on some of those as the foundation for this book. Tonight's book that we're focused on is called White Space, Black Hood, Opportunity, Hoarding, and Segregation in an Age of Inequality. We're going to talk about what she's arguing in that book and what she's highlighting in a minute. She has won several awards for her authorship, and she's also a 3-time nominee for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for nonfiction. And additionally, she's published widely. I'm sure you've read her in many popular magazines and news outlets, including Politico, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, The Root, Salon, and others. I can go on and on about her, but you can look at her bio at your leisure. For now, I want to just tee up our conversation by inviting Professor Cashin to talk about how she came to write this book, particularly in light of her other work. I will say that one of the first articles that I read from Professor Cashin is called The Tyranny of the Favorite Quarter. I teach state and local government law, and she has long written in that area. And this book reminds me of that work in the following sense. She talks a lot about not just segregation, but kind of the way that we've organized ourselves in places where we live and the way that law has facilitated that. So I wonder, Professor Cashin, if you can situate this book in light of your other work and just talk about what motivated you to write this book and what is different at this moment in time about these subjects. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And first off, why don't you call me Sheryll?
Okay, I'm going to call you Sheryll.
And I'll call you Sheila, right? And I want to just say thank you. I looked at the registrants, lots of my former students going way back over 20 years have registered. So I want to say hi and thank you. And even if you aren't a former student of mine, go Hoya Lawyers. I'm just thrilled that you chose to spend your evening with us. Now, so answering your question, Sheila, as you know, this issue of real estate and land and who lives where and why and who gets what benefits and why clearly has been an obsession of mine. As you said, that was an early tenure piece of mine, The Tyranny of the Favorite Quarter. And how did I come to write this book? I just can't let it go. I just can't. And what it's taken me, the whole of my academic career is culminating in this book, 2 decades of thinking and grappling with it. And I finally think I figured it out. I have a law degree. I have a degree in electrical engineering, and I'm a self-taught historian. And I have come to see, I argue that we have a system of residential caste. It's not just segregation, but the physical landscape of where everyone lives. It's constructed, and it is a caste system in that government overinvests and excludes in high opportunity space. It's and people who get to live there are basically riding the up elevator, and government contains and disinvests and frankly preys on people in low opportunity, particularly very Black neighborhoods. And it's like you're riding the down escalator there. And so this is the culmination of all that thinking. And I identify the systemic present, not past, present anti-Black processes that constitute residential caste. I hope that's responsive to your question.
Yes, it is. And I want to pick up there. So you focus on the geography of caste in the sense, the way that it results in opportunity hoarding of, good schools, good housing, good jobs by those people and communities who have, you say, more than enough, depriving those of who don't have nearly enough. But what I want to draw folks' attention to, and you hinted at it, is that you focus your attention on one group of folks who are left out, and that is who you call the descendants. And you acknowledge that there are other groups in American society, other Americans of color, indigenous groups that may also feel structurally deprived, but you make a point of focusing on the descendants. Can you talk about who the descendants are and why that's your focus?
Excellent question, Professor Foster. That's a professorial question.
Indeed.
So I use this term descendants as a term of affection, frankly, to label as this is what I call the people who are trapped in the hood, right? Residential caste was constructed beginning in the teens, the dawn of the 20th century, to contain the Black great migrants who were escaping Jim Crow in the South and going north and west, right? And what I'm arguing is that there's the word descendants is an acknowledgement of the unbroken continuum from slavery to Jim Crow to the iconic government constructed Black ghetto. And the dominant response to more than 6 million Black people moving over the first 7 decades of the 20th century was to contain them in their own neighborhoods and then redline and cut those neighborhoods off from the kinds of public and private investment that were rained down on white neighborhoods, right? And so my argument is that the residential caste system we have, it was constructed to contain Black Americans. We're all trapped in it, but it also, the descendants, are the true descendants of slavery. I mean, if you did a DNA test, I guarantee you, people who are in high poverty Black neighborhoods, I guarantee you there would be much DNA evidence going straight back to Africa. And what I argue is that, for Black American descendants of slavery, of which I am one, I also use descendants to define the Black Americans. It is highly defined by residential segregation. For example, recent Black immigrants, particularly, from Africa, from West Indies, from Britain, Jamaica, wherever, they tend to be more integrated residentially than Black American descendants of slavery. So I use that term to underscore, first of all, the historical continuum, why residential caste was created. And I center the experience of descendants because that's what residential caste is about, right? It's frankly premised on anti-Black fear, anti-Black American fear, right? But I acknowledge, right, there are other systems of oppression in this country. And those of you who took race and American law with me, we often talked about this, right? That, there are different forms of oppression, and we shouldn't try to put, Indigenous people, Mexican American people, so many different groups of color, we should never try to fit them into one box, right? So this book is about residential caste, and by definition, you have to talk about anti-Black subordination as a result of that. That doesn't mean, though, that other people of color and whites aren't harmed and affected by it. In fact, I argue that the only people who benefit from residential caste in this country are those that can afford to buy their way into very high opportunity, virtually poverty-free, heavily white neighborhoods.
So that's great. This leads me to one of your chapters. It's called "The Past is Not Past." Mm-hmm. You have a number of beautiful charts in the book, but the ones that are most affecting for me and distressing are the ones that show that the red line areas of many, in particular cities, right, that were predominantly Black and hence, redlined. If you look at those areas today in many cities, that those areas are still segregated and Black, right?
And distressed and underinvested in.
And distressed and underinvested. But you also say that concentrated poverty and this stratification is more complex than it used to be. So on the one hand, there's the history of redlining and racial zoning and all of the kind of explicitly racist ways that shaped where we lived and that we're living the legacy of, right? That's part of your point, right? And that we're back around to those levels of segregation and caste that we were in the 60s and 70s. But you say that it's more complex. And so I wonder how we might understand what you might call the old segregation and the new segregation or stratification. Can you just help us to understand?
So the old segregation, right? First off, this is what I often encourage. I've been doing tons of virtual, mainly virtual events, and often it's a bookstore in a particular place. And what I've started telling people is, if you really want to understand this, whatever city you live in or you're interested in, Google that city's name and redlining. So redlining Chicago, redlining Pittsburgh, redlining Cleveland, whatever, DC. And there are 200 or more than 200 cities in this country were geographically mapped. This is redlining. I don't want to assume you know about this, but do that and you'll see a map will come up of that city, and you will probably find a news article or something that tells a quick history of the old segregation and the old redlining. Virtually every city in this country in which a sizable number of great migrants landed were contained in using racially restrictive covenants and violence, frankly, were contained in their own neighborhoods and marked with a D, the lowest possible rating by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, as hazardous. And almost immediately, those neighborhoods started experiencing disinvestment, and you could not get loans, the kind of traditional 30-year mortgage loans that were offered and subsidized by the federal government in white areas. Okay, and that segregation continued straight through to the 60s. It's only with the Fair Housing Act and a civil rights revolution that housing opportunity begins to open up. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. My father, pre-Fair Housing Act, had to use trickery to get us into a majority white neighborhood that had the best school, and a school that my partially deaf brother needed to get into. We were only Black family at the Unitarian Church. What did he do? We got Unitarian friends to pretend to be the buyers and buy the house with our money. That's what we had to do. But that's the old segregation. First 7 decades of the 20th century, Black Americans are hyper segregated. And what with the opening of the Fair Housing Act begins to have each decade, from the 70s, really the 80s forward, you start to get some declines in segregation, right? But concentrated poverty census tracts do not go away. And in fact, the footprint of concentrated poverty in many places has exploded in the 21st century. And here's the complexity. What's complex is that concentrated poverty is growing fastest in some of these older suburbs where, particularly with the housing crisis in the 2010s, middle-class whites began to experience concentrated poverty, foreclosures, and for some of them for the first time. Concentrated poverty is growing very, very fast, but traditional, high poverty Black and brown census tracts persist, and they've expanded too. And I show maps in the book from the 21st century. Sometimes what's happened is the places of concentrated Black poverty have shifted and been moved, and you've got a clearing out in some areas of desired cities of affluent white space where concentrated poverty used to be. But it's very easy if you Google, poverty in the city you're interested in, you could typically find geographically coded maps and racially coded maps. And you'll see, particularly in cities that a lot of great migrants went to, there's still these stark boundaries, and people are familiar with it. Typically people can point out, oh, that's an affluent area, that's a poor area. And those boundaries are there and they're stark, but it's not just a Black-white thing, right? Black people are disproportionately exposed to concentrated poverty, but you can find brown people and struggling whites also exposed to it. But the sad thing, and I'll wrap this up, the sad thing is that there's a nasty politics in which some politicians can't help stoking division, rather than trying to unify the struggling people of all colors who end up in high poverty, low opportunity places.
And that's where I want to go next. That's a great tee up for me. So you described the system of American residential caste as involving three things. One is boundary maintenance, two is opportunity hoarding, and three is stereotype driven, surveillance. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about boundary maintenance, because that's where the politics comes in some sense, right? You talk about boundary maintenance and social distance, and you say there are stark lines around, let's say, neighborhoods or suburbs, even those are shifting demographics, as you say, that basically shut out or exclude from high opportunity areas the people that can't afford to pay directly for those goods, let's say through property taxes. How exactly does this happen in a race neutral way, right? How do you maintain what you call white space without the old mechanisms of overtly racist policy? In other words, as I think, who was it, Bonilla, that said, how do you maintain racism in a world without racists?
Well, I'm not even going to go there.
I'm not suggesting we're in a world without
racism without racists. I read the book. I know what you're talking about. Yeah. There are still a lot of individual racists in this world, but that said, the zoning code does most of this work. Well, it's the first actor, the first mechanism. There was an article recently in the New York Times which showed that, had a link to a number of cities, but in many medium and large cities in the United States, it is illegal to build anything other than a detached single family home on as much as 75% of the land, right? You imagine that 75% of the land in the city, the only housing that can be built is a detached single family home, right? There are so many people who can't afford that lifestyle, right? So that alone keeps, and it's clearly, Black and brown people have less money, less wealth, right? And a lot of it's these historic housing policies have created that gap, right? So that alone is a form of boundary maintenance, right? Now, you also get, among the modern practices, you get racial steering by realtors. You still have lots of discrimination in mortgage lending, right? Very recent studies showing that Black and Latinx people are much more likely to be discriminated, or they can be denied. They can be equally qualified to whites and denied the sort of traditional, less expensive mortgages that whites will get. There's a government subsidized affordable housing industrial complex, right? The federal government, the biggest subsidy for affordable housing construction in this country is the low-income housing tax credit. About $10 billion a year gets funneled through that tax credit to entities that build affordable housing. Only about 17% of the affordable units that get built every year are built in high opportunity areas, right? So the federal government is channeling billions of dollars annually to concentrate poverty, right? That's boundary maintenance, right? I could go on, but the local school boundaries are often drawn in ways that encourage housing segregation rather than trying to disrupt it. And then this is where we could talk about racism without racists, but there's a lot of resistance still by individuals, particularly whites, and I'm not calling whites racist, but there's still a lot of resistance to living in a neighborhood where more than a certain percentage of people are Black. If it gets above 10%, a lot of people resist that, particularly if it gets to 20%, So all of these things contribute to boundary maintenance. And sometimes the boundaries are, right across the street.
Right. And part of it is, as you say, kind of, and you don't use this language, but people lock themselves into these communities, right? Through politics, in particular through local politics, which zoning is about, which, school districts are about, school boards, right? We're seeing this play out as well. I want to focus a little bit on politics, both the national and local, and how that plays into a lot of the boundary maintenance and opportunity hoarding. You said it's made possible by a localized politics that few poor people, so I'm paraphrasing, you can really fully participate in and leverage, right?
They cannot fully participate in?
Yes, correct. That they cannot fully participate in and leverage. And that have been put in place to reinforce these boundaries. But so here's my question. Our politics right now in this country are quite toxic and tribal, right? Many would argue. And in light of that, I wonder who you see as the audience for this book. If the point is to change the politics at the national or local level that are locking in a lot of these policies and a lot of the ways that the federal government funds things and how things get built, how do we get around that? Right. I mean, the very geography that you're pointing to, the geography of caste, is becoming the geography of our politics.
Absolutely. So this is an important point. You guys are lucky I can't see you because I can't call on you to test you to see if you were listening. Aren't you happy? It's so much better to be out of law school and think fondly of being of your days at law school to actually be in it. I just submitted an exam today. But anyway, this is an important point that I really want to flag for you. One of the key points about the book is that segregation does affect politics. Reason we have opportunity hoarding is, when you have concentrated abundance and concentrated need, within the same city, or it's worse when it's apart, but you have direct horizontal competition for limited public and private resources between highly affluent and influential people and disempowered people. And so this is how it can happen, that even in a ostensibly Black run city like Baltimore, which has had, something like 7 of the last 8 mayors were Black, majority Black representation on the city council, they discovered to their own horror, when they looked at the numbers and did an equity analysis, that they were spending 2 to 4 times as much money in majority white neighborhoods as in majority Black neighborhoods, for basic things, community development, you name it, right? And that is replicated almost everywhere, except the few cities that are trying to disrupt it with a hard equity analysis in their budgeting. Okay, so that's the brutal politics that segregation ends up with. Now, when you add jurisdictional boundaries to segregation, and then you add gerrymandering on top of it, yes, it's toxic. It's worse than when I wrote my first book, The Failures of Integration, more than 20 years ago, right? So what was your second?
No,
your second is who's this book for? What I or
yes. So who's the audience if our politics, if the geography of caste has led to a political geography in which we don't listen to each other, we don't watch the same shows, we're racially segregated.
Right.
Who are you trying to convince?
Okay, I'm trying to convince the growing swath of what I call culturally dexterous white people. I coined that phrase with my previous book, Loving. What's a culturally dexterous white person? Person who looks at the growing diversity in their city, in this country, and it just accepts it. If not, welcomes it, right? And just has an attitude of okay, I'm going to play in this sandbox. I can't change the sandbox. I want to be part of the multiracial coalition that raises up everybody, that promotes the common good, and understanding that the common good includes a lot of people that are non-white, and that's okay. I'm reacting to it like at the PTA meeting or whatever. I'm not going to come in here with the attitude that my way goes. I'm going to come in the attitude of I'm going to practice robust pluralism and try to understand different ways of thinking about doing things, maybe make some friends, and I actually am optimistic about the possibilities for functional multiracial democracy in progressive cities. While we're fighting the longer fight, for democracy itself in this country, or the longer fight for, Brown v. Board or residential integration, it is possible now. And I hold up examples of this in my final chapter, which is called Abolition Repair.
We'll come back to that. So I want to come back to
but it is so my audience is first of all, I'm not my heroine here. You're welcome to my library, people. My heroine, Toni Morrison, right? I've read every word, every book she's written, but in this most recent book of essays, there's an essay in there where she says, some things may never change, but we can write about it and we can tell the truth. And Toni Morrison never apologized for saying that she was writing about the Black American experience and writing for Black people, right? Other people were welcome to, but one of my audience, a big audience for me, is descendants, and said, here's our experience. I want you to understand it. And I also am lifting up a lot of examples of resilient Black people but the other audience is non-Black people. I'm trying to humanize my folks and our experience. And like I said, I do think in a lot of places there is a majority coalition that wants something better than a society that's premised on separation, inequality, and fear.
Right.
You know, so I welcome people of all colors, you know, but I do, I'm trying hard to reach Black readers too.
Yeah. I want to return to Baltimore because you start the book with Baltimore. And let's say not Detroit, for instance. One of the audience members who submitted a question said that they're about to move to Detroit and how much of this applies there. And I think that we all know it does. But I have two questions. One is, you mentioned the disparity in how much a Black-run city spends in white areas more than in Black areas. And I wonder what your account is for how that happens, even when descendants are in power. And second, there's a question that came in the Q&A just now by Rosemary Kilkenny that asks about the disparity in appraisals, right, for Black and white homeowners that you know about, and that it shows up in particular in Montgomery County. So both of these are focused on Maryland. So I want to kind of ground the conversation a bit in kind of what we know about what's going on in a Black-run city like Baltimore, but also a state like Maryland that has a lot of Black political power and Black local power, but yet we have a defunding of an important transportation line there, right, by the governor. And we have, you know, these continuing patterns that you write about in the book. So what's your account of A, Baltimore, and B, what's going on in a kind of progressive state like Maryland in terms of these issues?
Okay, so I want to applaud Baltimore. Actually, is trying to disrupt this, right? So the new mayor was a champion of racial equity. You hear this phrase racial equity a lot, but Baltimore, Minneapolis, and Seattle are three cities that I know of that have passed laws that require a consideration of racial equity in how funds are allocated. I don't know the specifics of each city, but they are trying to abolish and repair this practice. But how does it happen? Well, how does it happen in any city? You know, look in DC where we are, right? How does it happen that, you know, all this new luxury development, the wharf and all these luxury, you know, some of this stuff is so luxurious. I, with my 3 degrees, don't necessarily feel comfortable, you know, walking down this promenade in the middle of the city where, you know, Gucci and Tiffany and Chanel is here, right? But what happens is developers have a way of bending development to their will, and elites do too, right? Those with the most influence, like you know, in Baltimore, they're the founder of Under Armour, a billionaire. He has this vision of there's this big shine. I call it the Emerald City. This big new development, sort of on a peninsula, sequestered away from the rest of the city, that's going up. They got $600 million in tax increment financing from the city of Baltimore. You know, influential people have a way of bending development to their will, right? And this is what, you know, the original segregation and the original redlining in this country, the so-called American dream of suburban living, all of those policies, you know, the interstate highway program that made it easy to get out of the city into the suburbs, right? All of these grand policies were designed to meet the needs and desires and wants of white residents and their residential dreams, their American dreams, right? Black people
Even in a Black city. I mean, even in a Black-run city, right? I mean, that's your point. Even in a Black-run city.
Even in a Black-run city.
That
right?
the local politics of that.
Right. So a lot of the local, squeaky wheel influence, right? That's the answer to that question. And Rosemary, right? She asked about
the appraisal, right? The discriminatory appraisals, when Black homeowners have their houses appraised, and white homeowners do that. There are different appraisals, and when Black homeowners remove all of the indicia of Blackness from their homes, and appraisers come back, all of a sudden their houses are appraised hundreds of $1,000s more. Where does that fit into your story? I think I know, but
well, markets tend to overvalue whiteness and devalue Blackness. It's just that simple. And there's a lot of white avoidance of Black neighborhoods, and because whites make up the majority of real estate markets, right? That tends to depress Black home values. There's less demand for it. People will pay less for it. All right. So, and I've learned this, when I sell houses, we definitely take down all the Black pictures, take down the Black art. We do this, but there's only so much you can do if you are in a majority Black neighborhood. My husband and I, we intentionally bought in historically stably integrated neighborhoods, not overwhelmingly white neighborhoods. We didn't want to raise our Black twin sons in overwhelmingly white neighborhoods where the data suggests that Black boys don't do so well in those kinds of areas, right? So we went in the middle with stably integrated Shepherd Park. Now we're in Crestwood, right? And thank you to our Jewish brothers and sisters who were willing to sell homes to Black people, beginning in the 50s and 60s in those neighborhoods, right? But it's systemic. Dorothy Brown writes about this in her book, The Whiteness of Wealth. She has a whole chapter about housing and some of these systemic issues of devaluing of Black neighborhoods.
So let's talk about what we do about this. And so first, there's the old-fashioned discrimination, which is what we just talked about. That still exists. I just want to make clear that all of this, discrimination in the market, whether it's it was the foreclosure crisis that hit Black communities the hardest, and many of those redlined areas at the end of the last recession, or discriminatory appraisals, or a host of other kinds of discrimination. But I want to focus also on opportunity hoarding, right? Partly that is locking up this opportunity, even when there's not overt forms of discrimination, or where there are, but there are also these other rules, race neutral rules at work. I read your, in the chapter where you talk about the psychological and emotional toll that this all takes on Black Americans, in particular, Black American children. Right. I read your intervention as embracing not just what the federal government used to call deconcentrating poverty, which is giving vouchers to poor folks to find opportunity in the suburbs, for instance, but also embracing programs designed to promote stability in core urban areas that are now gentrifying and becoming whiter and wealthier, like Washington. And so I wonder if you think that, notwithstanding the existing discrimination and the opportunity hoarding, that there's still a role for this kind of highly impactful policy responses, not opportunity zones, which both you and I have problems with, right? Maybe not move to opportunity, maybe not the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act, but other interventions that can break up this opportunity hoarding, this cartel, so to speak. So give me some, are you a believer still in the role?
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, let me make it clear. I am totally down with affirmatively furthering fair housing, right? It is the law, and every entity that receives federal funding for development or housing is supposed to comply with it, right? So I do believe in that. I believe that as a moral matter and as a legal matter, every community, particularly high opportunity, poverty-free communities, which are that way because they were constructed that way, to engage in exclusion, right?
And what does that rule do?
I believe they are obligated to have their fair share of affordable housing, right? I mean, so-called liberal California has been trying for years to repeal the single-family zoning ordinance just to open up all communities, but particularly high opportunity ones, to multifamily apartments, right? So I'm down with that. I haven't given up on that. I haven't given up on Brown. I support school integration, right? But while we're fighting those battles, which are never going to end, and there's going to be a lot of resistance, right? I also argue that historically defunded Black neighborhoods deserve to be green-lined rather than red-lined. I mean, this has been going on for 8 decades now. There was a Fed study that I cite that said, to this day, you look at a neighborhood that was marked with a D and redlined 80 years before, that decision correlates today with segregation and disinvestment. So, like the mayor in Chicago, for example, Chicago's the textbook example of concentrated poverty and concentrated affluence. God bless the new mayor. I'm forgetting the woman's name, but you might remember her name.
Yeah, Lightfoot.
Right, Mayor Lightfoot, sister girl, right? But she's got a new initiative to spend $1 billion on the West Side, right? That they have in Chicago, the number is 4-1. They've been I think it is 4. White neighborhoods get like 4 times the public and private investment as Black neighborhoods, right? And this has been going on. So I argue for prioritizing as a moral matter, the state has an obligation to repair what it has constructed and maintained, right? So I say descendants in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, they should be first in line for school lotteries to great schools. Maybe, if you don't have enough money for a universal basic income program for everybody, maybe the folks in high poverty neighborhoods should get priority for a pilot. Something about like 60 cities now are supporting universal basic income pilots, right? If we get this, we did get the physical infrastructure bill passed, right? All right. So a lot of money is going to start flowing for infrastructure, right? If you look at the story of big public infrastructure in this country, most of that money has been spent in ways that damaged Black neighborhoods, mowed through them, lots of trauma for the benefit mainly of whites in cars, right? My fear is that some of this infrastructure dollar is going to continue to be spent in that way, right? So I argue that they should be priorities, and God bless President Biden for saying that they're about racial equity and that you should pay attention, to racial equity and how funds are spent. So
but you have to operationalize it. Let me ask you a couple questions about that. One is the political, I guess, reality of doing that. And I think one answer is that Biden has this Justice 40 commitment, at least this first executive order, promising that 40% of the investments, in particular in the climate area, will go to frontline communities of color. So it seems like, at least depending on who's in the administration, there's some political will to do that. I mean, there's questions about metrics on that, but legally, I wonder, and it's just a geeky question. I know some of your past students will have this question. Can you really prioritize on the basis of race with the conservative federal courts and the anti-affirmative action jurisprudence that we have on the book? So even if there were the political will all the way down from federal through state through local,
well,
can you do that?
I didn't say race.
I
said historically defunded neighborhoods. Okay. Historically, so there's a huge correlation, right? You could just do this, and I recommend doing this way, right? Because what I want to be sure is that the people trapped in neighborhoods that have been on the receiving end of 8 decades of hostile public policy that's caused a lot of trauma. I want to be sure that those neighborhoods are the ones that are prioritized. And it's actually pretty easy. You just pull up an HOLC map, or you have a demographer identify the high poverty city census tracts in your city, right? Demographers use 40% as a cutoff. A neighborhood where 40% or more of the people are poor is a distressed high poverty neighborhood. And I guarantee you, if you go and look at the census tracts that meet that threshold of concentrated poverty, most of them, there's a history and a story of intentional segregation, intentional disinvestment, and that's what the reparations program that what's the city in Illinois?
Right, that's right. The city in Illinois.
Right, they did this based not on race per se, but I don't know. Maybe they're designed, but I think this can be done. I'm not talking about cutting a check to an individual just because they're Black. I'm not doing that. I'm talking about a city reckoning with its own history, which is not that far off, right? It's not like 400 years ago, of constructing and maintaining residential caste. And the beauty, and I hope you guys will read the book, right? I actually worked really hard to make it readable and accessible.
It's very readable.
Story driven.
It's actually riveting. Yeah, it's.
I mean, thank you for that word, riveting, because I have worked very, very hard this is my 5th book. You see, I'm surrounded by books. I just love books. I love literature. To unlearn academic writing. I have literary pretensions, I really try to be a literary writer, even as I'm writing about very serious things. But the beauty, once you understand residential caste and its processes, the way forward are actually obvious. You just do the opposite, right? So greenlining of historically defunded neighborhoods, which are easily identified by, poverty criteria that overlays heavily with race. So greenlining and prioritizing those places for investment rather than continuing practice of opportunity hoarding and defunding. Inclusionary zoning rather than exclusionary zoning, trying to create, God forbid, some integrated neighborhoods and schools rather than maintaining boundaries. And we haven't gotten into the surveillance. This is what my colleagues, Paul Butler and Chris Henning, who I think is on with us tonight, write about. But I say that we need to change the lens in which we see descendants from presumed thug to presumed citizen. And when you change that lens and see them as 3-dimensional human beings worthy of the moniker citizen, it frees you up to focus on evidence-based strategies for public safety, for example, that actually, and I give some examples of this, cost a lot less than mass incarceration or stopping and frisking everyone. and are more effective in creating a safer place, right? So
one of the things that's going on, I think, and just to follow up on that, is that the old kind of federal, top-down federal solutions, like, move to opportunity or deconcentrating poverty, which I think did some good, but have mixed results. Opportunity zones, obviously, empowerment zones, enterprise zones. Some of that is really what you're talking about, like you target low or high poverty areas and you invest in them. Those have not been great, right? But I think one thing you do, which is great, is that you look at local experimentation, right? And I'm not saying move those to the side, but you're looking at largely progressive mayors, many of which, right, in the examples that you just mentioned, and progressive cities and progressive city councils, and maybe even progressive states like California, who are trying out things like inclusionary zoning, universal basic income, new approaches to police reform and service delivery, participatory budgeting, abolishing, single family zoning. I mean, am I right to read you that that's kind of?
Well, we need to proceed on
both fronts. Yeah.
But the main thing I do, so the overarching pillars I have is, okay, I've told you the three main anti-Black processes of residential caste. You need to dismantle them, and
you think local government
something new. And so my biggest proposal for reversing boundary maintenance is inclusionary zoning, right? Inclusionary zoning.
So local government. So you have a lot of faith.
Types of housing.
Yeah.
Particularly, our graduates are coming out of our law school, with ridiculous amounts of debt. I mean, I think we've done a lot, right? We do a lot, but still, a lot of people would be thrilled to be able to buy a duplex, a quadplex, a studio, a micro house, this common living kinds of structures, right? Would be thrilled to have, a wide range of different types of living possibilities, other than a great big house with a yard to take care of.
And local governments they have control over zoning. They have control.
They absolutely do.
Over budgeting.
They absolutely do. And unfortunately, that's been used mainly for parochialism and protecting the interests of mainly of the people who can afford a single family home, right? But so let me make clear, it's not either or. And so the investment, I worked on empowerment zones in the Clinton White House, so it's funny you mentioned that, but I'll say basic investment by cities in trash collection, services, sewers, schools, these are things that have been underfunded in Black neighborhoods, right? So I'm not talking about just prioritizing private investment. I'm saying that Black neighborhoods that have been historically defunded should be getting their fair share of, all of the resources that go into infrastructure, right? I just want to make that clear. So
the question is how to make that happen, right? That's really what I was focused on.
Okay, so one way to make that happen is to mandate a neighborhood analysis that is annually part of the budgeting, where you look at the data. And this is what, as I understand it, Baltimore and Minneapolis and Seattle are doing, right? When data can drive can raise awareness about where investments are going. And if you have built in requirements of racial equity, it should get better over time. And, some fund, Baltimore actually created also a special fund that's for racial equity spending that's designed to help counter some of these decades of disinvestment.
Right. So let's go to a couple audience questions. So you have one from Stanley Brown. My question goes to the question of remedies. He says, Norfolk's St. Paul's quadrant is overwhelmingly Black and poor with an average of 12,000 in annual income. 3 major public housing projects in St. Paul's. Otherwise, it's mostly parking lots. It's right next to downtown, but locked in by street configuration. City gets no tax revenue now, but would get lots if more affluent people move in. City's remedy: tear down first the housing project that had 600 families. All the Black households have to move out for years while the area is being redeveloped. Using vouchers, they are ending up in segregated areas of the city, but only 226 replacement units in the redeveloped area for 1/3 of the people who left. This plan got $30 million from HUD's CNI program. I believe that's the Community and Neighborhoods program. Initiative, right. The city's rationale is that it's creating a mixed income area, and now it is an area of minority concentration. Your thoughts on that approach and the whole issue of gentrification through government redevelopment? This scenario can be repeated, has been repeated in so many cities.
That's such a common story is happening in DC. Is that, you know, and so the textbook ideal example for the replacement of high-rise, particularly public housing, but the public housing program was one of the main mechanisms for creating concentrated Black poverty, right? And so I support the idea of replacing old, crumbling, concentrated poverty housing projects with mixed income developments. But the ideal is that 100% of the people displaced get to come back. You build densely, you build high, right? And everybody should get to come back. At minimum, everybody should get a voucher to get to high opportunity. It doesn't happen, right? A lot, you know, the studies of moving and opportunity, some of these other HUD-sponsored experiments is just as this story says. Often what happens is people move to perhaps a somewhat less marginal neighborhood, but one that's still segregated and not high opportunity, right? And there's not that much affordable housing in high opportunity places. So, you know, sometimes the best you could do is get people into medium opportunity. But I do think over the long term, breaking up concentrated poverty is necessary to creating a society where people, frankly, don't look at Black people and Black bodies with fear. A lot of, you know, so I have a whole chapter about stereotypes and myths about the people in the hood, right? And we've been through 50 years of this, right? Dog whistling about the people of the hood. Welfare queen, super predator, thug. You know, it's just gone on and on. Trump, he could never talk about a Black urban neighborhood without saying it was violence and rat infested, right? But these perceptions of Black people get incubated in crime stories, you know, and you know what happened. I'm uncomfortable even talking about it because I don't want to participate in myself. But you know, people associate, particularly people who have no intimate knowledge of Black people, no intimate experience with Black people, right? So they associate what they pick up in the crime stories or The Wire or whatever with affordable housing. That's what's going to come to my neighborhood. And so it's just toxic and very difficult. And I believe as long as we have extremely concentrated Black poverty in this country, those stereotypes are going to continue. right? And so we have painful work to do. I don't support this story, though, of trying to scrub a city or an area of poor Black people, particularly now that people want to be in the city, like, oh, this is strategically located, we could like get rid of these people and raise our tax base. And frankly, that's a story that happened in DC and, in the 90s and the early 2000s. So that's a very problematic story.
Yeah.
But there are examples of very well designed redevelopment of formerly 100% impoverished public housing to mixed income. But there's just not a lot of political will to do it the right way.
Right. And even in the most liberal cities, even some that you mentioned, Seattle, New York, clearly, San Francisco, et cetera, notwithstanding them sharing the politics and our politics and all of these issues, they find it difficult, even through inclusionary zoning, to do what you're suggesting. Why? In part because land values are so high because of market actors. And I just wonder how local politicians can discipline, let's say, the Amazons of the world, or the Googles and Facebooks who come into a city and make it difficult to even put in place policies. Because with inclusionary zoning, I mean, who are those units really affordable to? If the AMI in your area is so high that even 80% of that AMI crowds out the poorest people that you're talking about. And
right.
It's right. And so it's just a wicked problem.
Yeah, but this is part of the reason why I don't focus exclusively on housing and school integration, right? Because that's in many ways we have gotten worse. I have a stat in a recent piece I wrote for Politico. I can't remember the exact, but the Othering and Belonging Institute came out with this great study on residential segregation over the summer. And they found that in something like 80% of cities, residential integration is worse than it was 20 years ago, residential segregation. So we're getting worse, not better, right? And so meanwhile, there are strategies that can greatly improve the lives of people and enhance their possibilities for their own transformation and liberation, what their dreams are for themselves, or getting a job, doing better, right? And so I feature some of that stuff.
Exactly. And I think, and I think you've said this, you need federal funding with strings attached that kind of mandates some of this. That A is going to pay for it at the local and state level, and B is going to mandate it.
But one thing to keep in mind is that residential CAS was like 7-8 decades in the making. It's not going to disappear overnight, right? But we do need to get started on policies that can make things better and building the coalition for something different than what we have, because it's not working well for most people.
True. That's true. Okay. So another question, Mike Mazzella. Hi, Professor Cashin. I love the book, and I'm glad you and your family are doing well. The impact of climate change and pollution disproportionately affect racially segregated neighborhoods, often resulting in communities of color suffering from worse air and water quality, hotter temperatures in the summer due to lack of greenery and more asphalt than their counterparts in predominantly white neighborhoods. With the infrastructure bill moving forward in Congress, how do we ensure that the funds directed for renovating, repairing, modernizing our cities are used for the benefit of those that have historically suffered most from pollution, extreme weather, and dilapidated housing conditions? How do we know the money will be used where it's needed most and not allocated similarly to the public school funding you describe in the book, where the wealthier, whiter public spaces get more funds and browner and blacker neighborhoods get less than they need?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for your good wishes. And thank you for reading the book. I couldn't, what was the name? Who's the name of the person?
Mike Mazzella.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Well, we were just talking about that, right? You are more knowledgeable than me to answer this question, Professor Foster. You were talking about that 40%.
Right, the Justice 40 initiative, which actually was scaled up from a state. New York first put that in place, and New York had that framework from environmental justice advocates in the state. And the Biden administration picked up on that, and in his first executive order, he's promised that 40% of the federal investments, at least in climate and energy, will go to so-called frontline communities, which are environmental justice communities.
And I need to read up on that. I hope that's true. But that example and the question shows that, climate change is a lens for getting at these issues, that the urgency of it and just the truth of it, right? There's been reporting about it where they show geographically map. It is shocking how few trees and cover you have in poor areas, right? And so my hope is that this can be an additional angle for getting some racial equity in a way that also serves our concerns about the climate, because they're mutual, right?
Yes, and I will add the red line maps also overlay perfectly on the heat island.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Same neighborhoods, exact same neighborhoods.
Yes. Okay, June Jeffrey says, while the Jewish people did sell their houses, I think this is a reference to an earlier comment of yours. While the Jewish people did sell their houses to Black folk, as they did in Detroit, it was because they were fleeing us Black folks, like the rest of the white people did. We were the second Black family on our block. I was almost 2 when we moved in 1955. By the time I started kindergarten, there was one white Jewish family with children on the block.
Fair point, but let me say this: the 2 neighborhoods I was talking about, we lived in Shepherd Park for almost 2 decades. Actually, I lived there longer than that, because I bought a little bungalow in there when I was single, right? I chose Shepherd Park because it had a history of intention, a biracial coalition that intentionally tried to create and maintain racial integration. So it was one of the few stably integrated neighborhoods, a bit like Shaker Heights. There are a couple of a half dozen neighborhoods that I featured in my first book, The Failures of Integration, kind of had this history of intention. So yes, there was a lot of flipping, and that what the was it June? Was that her name, June? Right?
Yes, June Jeffries.
What Miss Jeffries describes is more common, the flipping, but Shepherd Park and Crestwood both have a history of more stable integration that was maintained. And to this day, I live in this neighborhood where there are a lot of Blacks, Jews, and other people living together. And I feel good about my now 15-year-old twin Black boys. I have no worries. I didn't have it in Shepherd Park either, of a neighbor calling the police on them about something, or having a knee-jerk reaction to them with their wild hair and hoodies or whatever. You know what I'm saying? And in fact, I'll say, and I'll wrap this up real quick because there may be other questions. Raj Chetty has done research on not just which counties in the country have the most and the least social mobility in this country, but he did research particularly about Black boys, and only 5% of the neighborhoods in this country have features that where such that there's almost no education gap, learning gap, achievement gap between Black boys and their white counterparts. And some of the features of those neighborhoods, I'm sure Crestwood is one of them, is that there tends to be a lot of two-parent Black fathers around, quite a few Black, but there also tends to be very low anti-Black prejudice, right? And sort of a, culture of good government, getting along, right? And I'm fortunate that I have money and the sophistication to figure that out, right? I have friends who have taken their money. In fact, economic segregation is rising fastest among Black and Latinx people. Black and Latinx people, one percenters, are moving to opportunity, right? Me and my husband could have moved to like Fairfax or something. I have friends who moved to situations like that. I know one family who moved back because of some soul-killing experiences, right? Anyway, this is an aside. I can't remember how I got in this.
Yeah, no, that's right. Talking about the Jewish family in Detroit. A few more questions that came in before the talk, some of which we've covered, but I want to just give you an opportunity to say anything differently. Several alums, Renee DeVigny, Law 82, Renee Murphy, Law 10, and Adelina Reyes Gavilan, Law 95, are asking about how we continue to make progress on these issues when our democracy is quickly fraying on many levels.
Well, this is why I said, the one context that gives me hope in this country is where I think we can get some traction now is in progressive cities, frankly, where Democrats are in charge. We had something like 20 million people protest after George Floyd's slow execution. I think there is, despite the backlash, right? The backlash to the bit of racial reckoning we were having, I still think that there are a lot of people of goodwill that are open to what I call equality innovation. Actually, I stole that from Robin Leonard. And I cite you, Robin. I cite you in the book. I just cited you, right? But I love that, right? That we have cities who are engaging in equality innovation right now, right? Lawrence, Massachusetts, quite a few cities decided to make their bus routes from the poorest neighborhoods free. Just trying things, right? So one thing you can do is run for office or vote for people who you think are going to try to do something different than just maintain the status quo. Right. I hold up innovators in education where, anyway, you get the point. Is democracy dying in America? Is democracy at peril? Absolutely. So, everybody needs to register to vote, get to vote, but it's not an either or, right? But this is the context. Residential caste is most profound. Everybody lives somewhere, right? But residential caste is most profoundly affected by local decision making, and that's why I focus on it. And I see examples of cities trying to do something different.
Right, and I think just to put a pin in the point, there are a lot of different democracies in our country, right? And there are local democracies, and that's really what you're talking about. And people can get involved. Look at the new crop of young mayors. Many of them are
right. That's within our power.
Yeah.
Now some progressive cities get slapped down in red states, right, trying to raise to 15 hours an hour, but that's where I see some great levers for innovation and change.
So Margaret Thompson, Law 02, says, I'm aware that different cities produce different patterns of segregation. And of course, decades later, we're still looking for responses to mitigate that. Does local control make the most sense? We just covered that. Or should the response be public and private? So we've talked about opportunity zones, empowerment zones. A lot of those depend on private investment. And so we've talked around some of it. What is your view about the role of market actors, private actors in undoing this opportunity hoarding?
So there are good actors and there are bad actors, right? Private equity has been terrible um, in private equity, and like sort of the foreclosure crisis that we had in 2010 was born of predatory lending that was focused heavily on Black people and Black neighborhoods, Black and brown neighborhoods, I should say. Segregation facilitated the targeting of some neighborhoods for predatory credit products that would, are never peddled to middle class white people in, stable majority white neighborhoods, right? So there was some evidence that some people, whistleblowers, blew the whistle and said that they were basically told to target Black neighborhoods, right? And then after the foreclosure crisis, we have this phenomenon, in particular, a lot of private equity is driving it, of speculators coming in, buying up foreclosed properties, and then selling them back to the very Black people who were preyed upon with installment contracts, not even loans, that are designed for failure, right? They want people to fail, so people don't get any equity. It's like buying a house on layaway. They don't get any equity. If they default just once, the person can churn them, and they are just churning properties and continuing to prey on people. It's evil. It's evil, right? So there are good actors and there are bad actors, right? I had a wonderful call last week. I didn't know about it, but a very large community development financial institution is getting into mortgage lending and doing a lot of credit literacy and helping people. What this person is Black with a lot of investment banker and investors, right? But this person figured out Black people, most Black people pay their bills, and a lot of them are paying bills like the cable bill, the utility bill, right? He's helping them through micro lending build up their credit, so that and he's taking risks, giving them traditional mortgages at like 20, 30 basis points less than what the big bank lenders do, right? And so there's again some innovation. But I'm skeptical because of this history of Black people and Black neighborhoods just being preyed upon, and their wealth, whatever wealth they had, being taken from them. So
even of CDFIs, you're expecting a Black. No, only because some would say, I think Black capitalism would say that, a lot of the folks in Hollywood, et cetera, who are trying to build Black communities from within with this kind of micro entrepreneurship or micro capital, et cetera. It sounds like, I just want to be clear that you're skeptical of those, because it's still.
No, I'm not skeptical of that. So this guy I was talking to, I was really excited. Yes. And he may be getting some backings from some very, very famous sports figures, right? I'm all down with that. I'm just saying that, the regulators fell down. Right. If majority white neighborhoods have been preyed upon to this degree, I don't know. I don't know the financial interest that much. A lot of white people also lost homes and were foreclosed upon and preyed upon too, But I'm just saying that, I wholeheartedly support investment, particularly investment in Black entrepreneurship. I just think we need to be careful, because the predominant story with outside speculators has been, using the hood, Black people who after whites fled, they end up paying more for the house than it was worth. And so there's this history of predation that makes me highly skeptical. But I wholeheartedly support trying to educate investors about opportunities for investment. But I feel better if there's evidence of authentic partnership.
Right. And I just want
partnership with communities.
Yes,
right?
exactly. We have time for one more question, and if no one's in the Q&A, so let's just end with a couple people. Eric Williams, Law 94, what led you to write the book and give it a particular title? So we've talked a little about your book writing process. And Sierra Eccles, Law 21, what did you most enjoy?
Sarah, my student.
Writing about
I saw a lot of my segregation law seminar people were in there. Love you all.
So let's end on the book writing process, but there's one more student, Nancy Cantalupo from Law 03. We talked a little bit about this, but she's asking about Detroit specifically and what you learned about Detroit in the book. So let me give the last word to you both on the book writing process and anything else you want to say about Detroit or any other cities that you have a view on.
Okay, so very quickly, the book writing question, I wasn't sure what the question was. Why did I give it this title? Or
just kind of what did you most enjoy about writing this book? And yes, and the titles. But yeah, so those were from two separate folks. But
okay, very quickly, what I most enjoyed was almost every chapter opens with a story of a descendant and their experience with what I'm about to talk about. And I really enjoyed, that's where I got to really be literary. I also, I'm a visual artist and I curated all of the photographs. I tried to have beautiful photographs of my people, right? So that was fun, but I worked hard. This book almost killed me. It was really, really hard. So much research to marshal. What's the other question?
So I think the title speaks for itself. We've talked about that a lot. And the only other question was really about Detroit. I think we've talked about that, but I wonder if you would end on a kind of hopeful note about cities like you started with Baltimore, and as I said, there are lots of other places like Baltimore, Detroit, Buffalo, Stockton. There are a lot of cities that are struggling with inclusion because they're expensive, like Detroit or like, Washington, Seattle, et cetera, but a lot of cities that are still struggling, like Detroit. What do you think? And a lot of those are black cities still, right?
Well, there's a lot of affordable housing in Detroit.
So you think folks
there's a lot of affordable housing in Baltimore. I just gave a talk in Baltimore, and the person who interviewed me is a Black woman who just decided that she was going to develop an entire block and build out from there. I'm forgetting her name. I'm so sorry, but I'm just so there are opportunities there, and if you're, if so many Black people have given up on integration, they just have given up. They're tired. They're weary, right? And I am inspired by some examples of people saying, I'm just going to try to build my Wakanda, in my city, right? And see what I can do. I don't have all of the answers, right? I just think it has to be both and, right? That my main point with this book, and I'll close with this, is that my argument is basically that the government that created these structures has an obligation to abolish and repair. Whatever else individuals choose about what their ideal situation is and what they want for themselves and their family, the government has no business investing in, doubling down on segregation that is at the center of inequality in this country.
So that's great. And I will just close with, first of all, thanking you for writing the book, for the time that you spent in writing the book. It truly is a riveting book, Sheryll. And I think it's really hard to strike a balance between all of the theories and all of the history and the law that we teach and have in our heads and write about in law journals, but also speaking so close to the ground, which I think you do in the book, which is by telling stories, by constantly grounding us in the reality. And I also think it ends quite hopefully, right? Which I like. I mean, it ends with a cry for what you call healing, right, and abolition. And I think that, with a lot of policy innovation, a lot of political will, and, we can get there. So thank you. And it's been
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a great hour and a half. And thank all of you who are still on the call. I think it was a great conversation.
Thank you so much, and happy birthday. Go enjoy your birthday. And I just appreciate the 56 people who are still here. Love you all. Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Bye. Good night.